This is Balmoral, the smallest cruise ship in the Fred Olsen Cruise Line's fleet. One of the questions that I get asked so often is, do I prefer a huge cruise ship or a smaller cruise ship? And this one behind me is in fact one of the smallest that I've ever cruised on. Throughout this whole experience with Fred Olsen, I've realised that there are some real benefits to cruising on this size of ship. And that's exactly what I want to walk you through in this video today. So in this video, I'm going to share with you everything I've learned about the importance of small ship cruising and why I genuinely think you should consider this size of ship for one of your future cruises. Anyway, enough from me here. Let's get on to Balmoral and let me walk you through what I've learned this week. Welcome to my cabin here on Balmoral, and let's start by looking at the first of the things that I've learned this week about cruising on a smaller cruise ship, and that is that these smaller cruise ships can take you places that the big ones simply can't. Now, I thought I knew this, but this week has completely turned everything on its head and proven it to me from a whole new perspective. Let me explain. In the past, I've cruised to ports all around the world where I've left the ship and I've then had to board a shuttle bus. I'll then sit on that bus for 10 minutes, 20 minutes, sometimes longer to get to the main downtown area. And then when I arrive, I'm quite shocked actually to see that there are other much smaller ships than the one I've been travelling on docked right there in the heart of the action. Now, I always thought when people told me that the small ships go to places the big ones can't, I always thought that's what they meant. But this week, I've been really enjoying what's called Scenic Cruising, and I haven't really experienced a great deal of scenic cruising on a ship like this before. Let me tell you what that looks like. I'm cruising with Fred Olsen Cruise Lines this week, and they specialise in a lot of Norwegian itineraries. I've been experiencing the Norwegian fjords this week, and Scenic Cruising has featured on a number of days of this itinerary. What that looks like is that we leave a port, usually mid to late afternoon. We then, on our way out to sea or on our way to the next port, we'll enter sometimes one fjord, sometimes a number of fjords, and we'll then enjoy a very scenic cruise up that fjord. When we get to the top of the fjord or when we get to a certain attraction, for example, a waterfall, we'll then turn the ship all the way around to then sail back out of the fjord and back out to either sea or to our next port of call. All through that process, the cruise line are then telling us what we're seeing. So when we reach a waterfall, for example, the tannoy speaker will come on and say, ladies and gentlemen, on the starboard side, you will see X, or on the port side, you'll see Y. It's been really, really interesting to experience that this week. What's really shocked me this week is that when I stand on the deck and actually watch the ship rotating at the turning point in the fjord, we are so close to the cliff faces on either side. It's incredible to see. Now, this cruise ship isn't huge at all. There are others offering these fjord itineraries which are multiple times the size of this, and they simply just wouldn't fit up the fjord. And even if they did get up it, they certainly wouldn't be able to turn at the end. So it is really important that if you are looking at itineraries like, for example, Norway, make sure you pick a ship that you will like and a ship that you will enjoy cruising on, but also pick a ship that's actually going to show you the fjords rather than just the main ports, if that's what you want to go and see. Next, and you knew this was coming based on point one, the next thing that I've learned about cruising on smaller ships is that the smaller ships can get much closer to the action than the bigger ones. Okay, if you're cruising to somewhere like Norway, it's not all that relevant for a number of reasons, largely the fact that it's a glacial landscape, so the ships can get close because generally that water is really, really deep. The other thing that Norway has done, which is very clever, is that some of the villages and some of the towns have actually installed cruise docks that are supported by inflatable platforms that then allow these platforms to come out to meet the ship, and then at the end of the day, that dock will simply fold into the shore again, allowing the ship the space to turn. It's really, really clever to see that. But what I'm referring to here is the cities, particularly in the Mediterranean, where the mega ships just can't get in, but the smaller ones can. Think about even cities like Amsterdam, where you have to go through a lock system to get into the city. The smaller ships will make that, but if you're there on a mega ship, you'll probably dock somewhere like Rotterdam, and you'll then have to take a bus or a train or some other mode of transport to get all the way into Amsterdam. So it's definitely worth bearing in mind if you're considering taking a cruise on a bigger or a smaller cruise ship. Third, this one I've definitely realised this week, and that is that smaller cruise ships feel like a much more close-knit, smaller community. That applies to both the passenger community, but also the passenger and crew relationship. What I've found this week is that it's been so lovely to meet so many people on board this cruise ship that you then recognise almost every day when you see them at the different bars or the restaurants, or even when you're ashore. Because on a much smaller ship, you see these people far more often. On a large mega ship, at night, there can be 20, 30 different bars for people to go to. But on the ship that I'm travelling on at the moment, there's a much smaller number, meaning that if you're still up at midnight and you're looking to go to a bar to have drinks, there's a fair chance that you'll see the people who were there at midnight the night before. For example, there's not a huge amount of options of where you could go on a much smaller ship for obvious reasons. Now, don't worry, that doesn't mean that on a smaller ship you will constantly be surrounded by the same people. You can escape, so don't worry if your personality is currently thinking, oh no, a small ship isn't for me. I just really like the fact that I've got familiar faces all around the ship. Now, that applies to my relationship with passengers and how much I've enjoyed that, but I've also really liked the fact that when I walk around the ship, I recognise the crew, and the crew recognise me. This is also one of the first cruise ships that I've been on where so many of the crew have known me by name by day 2. It's been amazing and so interesting to see the crew members that you maybe haven't noticed that much, but they do refer to you as Fraser because they took your drink order last night and they've remembered you at the bar. It's very, very impressive. I haven't ever had that on a large cruise ship before, and I would say that that dynamic feels much more similar to what I experienced on my river cruise last year. So very impressive that I've experienced that on this cruise ship, which is holding just over 1,000 passengers. Number 4, generally speaking, and generally speaking is maybe the important part because it may have happened to me this cruise, it's harder to get lost on a smaller ship. You know the feeling if you've cruised on a mega ship before. You're trying to go back to your cabin at the end of the night. You're walking and you're walking and you're walking, and for whatever reason, your cabin or stateroom doesn't appear to be getting any closer. And in fact, you're walking in the complete wrong direction. It's happened to me so many times on the big ships, and on this ship this week, I found it so easy to get my bearings. Now, there are signs everywhere to help point you in the right direction, and there are also only 3 main staircases that you could use on here. So generally speaking, you'll know whether you're at the front, middle or back of the ship. And if you realise you're at the wrong one, it only takes a minute or two to get to the right side of the ship. So it's absolutely fine. I also find on a smaller ship, it's much easier to get your bearings by seeing things that you recognise. For example, my cabin here is directly beneath the pub. So I know that if I go to deck 7 at the end of the night and just walk along until I get to the pub, my cabin's just downstairs and it doesn't take long at all to get back to. So yes, generally speaking, but maybe this is a challenge to you, it's harder to get lost on a smaller cruise ship. Number 5, smaller cruise ships, believe it or not, can be easier to exercise on. I've been on some of the biggest cruise ships in the world, and if my cabin is on deck number 2 and the buffet is up on deck number 17, I'm probably not going to be walking up all of those stairs because I will be exhausted by the time I get to the end of the top. I'll be sweating, I won't be ready to then sit at a breakfast table. I will probably call for a lift or an elevator and I will stand in that all the way to the top, probably stopping at every floor on the way. On this cruise ship this week, I found that my cabin is on deck number 6, the dining room is on deck number 6, or the buffet is on deck number 7. So you don't have to be moving around the ship too much to go from venue to venue. That means that if I'm going for a drink in the evening, I'm much more likely to just take the stairs to go from deck 6 to deck 8, or deck 8 to deck 4, or deck 4 to deck 5. You get the picture. I feel like I'm moving around this ship far more than I would on a huge mega ship. Now, yes, that applies to things like taking an elevator up to breakfast or taking the stairs somewhere on a smaller ship, but it's also things like when I get back to the room at the end of the night, I've still got the energy to take my water bottle along to the water cooler, which is just one deck down and along to the front of the ship. On a mega ship, that can sometimes mean I have to go back to my room, get my water bottle, and then go up 10 flights of stairs to get to the bottle station, to then come back to the elevator and back downstairs. It's just so much easier on a smaller ship. The other thing that I've really liked about this cruise ship in particular is that when you go out onto the promenade deck on deck number 7, there's a huge sign on the wall that says what direction everyone's walking in today, because people on here love to go for a walk. And it also says that if you complete 4 laps, that equates to 1 mile. So I've been on, again, much bigger ships in the past where there maybe isn't a specific promenade deck that wraps all the way around, or there isn't a walking track, there isn't a jogging track. But on here, I know that if I do 4 laps of the ship, I've done a mile. Next, on this cruise this week, I've realised that some of the interactions on a smaller ship between crew and passenger can feel much more genuine than on a mega ship. Now, this might sound like a strange concept, but hear me out. On a couple of occasions, I've been to speak to crew at, for example, the shore excursions desk. I've found that as the cruise has gone on, I've got to know those people better, I've got to know their sense of humour more, they've got to learn what I'm like a bit better, and it's meant that rather than our conversation being them simply trying to sell me a trip from the cruise ship, we've been able to actually have a laugh and have quite a good conversation while we're in the process of that interaction. I've also realised that through my earlier point of getting to know the crew more and seeing the crew more often and familiar faces, I feel as though the interactions I have with my waiter at dinner are way more genuine than what I'd have on a huge ship, because on some cruise ships you can really feel like a number because there are 6,000 other passengers on board. But on here, that simply hasn't been the case, and I genuinely have met so many members of the crew who I think actually do care about how I've spent my day. I've really enjoyed that aspect of cruising on a smaller ship. Next up, and this one depends on who your neighbours are, but cruising on a small ship can mean that your ports of call are so much quieter than when you visit on a mega ship. Now, obviously, if I'm on a cruise ship with about 1,000 passengers, which was the case this week on Balmoral, if we dock in a village in Norway and every passenger leaves the ship, okay, yeah, there will be 1,000 people ashore. If, however, we're docked beside another huge cruise ship, that 1,000 might suddenly become 7,000 because there are 6,000 who have got off of another cruise ship. There was one port of call on this itinerary, which was Stavanger in Norway, where I really did realise this, because this small cruise ship docked beside a much bigger ship from P&O Cruises. So we docked directly beside P&O Iona, which is the largest ship, or one of the largest ships in the P&O Cruises fleet, serving the UK market. On all of the port calls on this itinerary, they felt really quiet, and especially when we've been in the fjords, you can actually go for a walk and not even see any other cruise passengers. It's been really lovely. But when we were in Stavanger, it was very apparent that there were quite a lot of tourists and quite a lot of cruise ship visitors in town. So if you are looking to visit, for example, Norwegian ports, and you want them to feel nice and quiet, you can just jump on the Port Authority websites to see what other cruise ships are scheduled to call that day. Now, these are obviously subject to change constantly, because if a cruise ship can't call somewhere because of weather or other reasons, it can always divert, and changes can happen last minute. But generally speaking, I found that these will be up to date at the start of the cruise season. So for Norway, for example, if you're looking for quiet ports, check the Port Authority websites a couple of months before the cruises really kick off for that year, and you should get a decent idea of just how busy your port is going to be. Next up, let's talk about embarkation and also disembarkation. So many people don't like to think about disembarkation, and actually I maybe shouldn't speak too soon because, as you can see, I'm still on the ship. So maybe for this one, let's just talk about embarkation. I found that embarkation on this much smaller cruise ship went so much quicker, and it was so easier than when I've embarked mega ships at the same cruise terminals. It's been very interesting experiencing a cruise to the Norwegian fjords on a cruise ship of this size, because I've embarked at exactly the same cruise terminal that I've used for so many other cruise ships. Sometimes I'll arrive at that terminal and the line will be all the way out to the front of the building. It can take quite a long time to make it through to wait in the waiting area to then get onto the ship. This time, however, from the moment I arrived at the terminal, I almost didn't stop moving until I got on the ship. I think the whole process of going from the front of the building onto the ship itself took about 5 minutes, and that included a walk of about a minute after check-in to get on the ship. I was so impressed. What I've got that down to, and this might be right, it might be wrong, but it's certainly what I found in my experience, is that these terminals are geared up to serve big ships with thousands of passengers. So when you get a smaller ship coming in, the buildings are obviously going to handle it absolutely fine. The staff are experts in embarking the bigger ships. So the whole process was just so much easier. So yes, embarkation, way more straightforward, way less stressful. And hopefully tomorrow when I leave this ship at the same terminal, it'll be equally as easy. That's it. That's what I've learned this week about the importance of ship size when it comes to planning one of your future cruises. Now, I do think it's important that everybody tries a cruise on a smaller ship, because I meet so many people who prioritise the mega ships of today because of the fact that they want to experience all of the mod cons that they've seen on social media. They want to see the drop slide, they want to ride the roller coaster, they want to go to the water park. These ships generally have everything on board. Now, with the smaller ships, it's so important that you remember that with a smaller ship, it's different, but it's in no way a compromise. And in fact, the smaller cruise ships can offer you something completely different to what the bigger ones can. When I was docked beside that huge P&O Cruises mega ship earlier this week, yes, okay, there was probably a part of me that thought, I bet that's really fun on there, and I bet they have all these really cool facilities that this older ship maybe doesn't have. But then none of the passengers on that ship, for example, have seen the much tighter, much smaller and much lesser known fjords that we've got to experience this week in Norway. It's been absolutely incredible. Now, I hope that you've enjoyed this video, and I really hope that it's maybe built your confidence up to try a cruise on a smaller ship at some point. I'd love to know from you in the comments. Have you taken a cruise on a small ship, and would you agree with my points in this video? And is there anything that I've missed where you would say, whoa, there's another huge benefit to small ship cruising? Or maybe you would say, I've tried it, but I prefer the mega ships. Let me know where you sit in the comments. I would love to hear from you. If you've found this video useful and if you've enjoyed it, then it would be great if you would support my channel by clicking both the thumbs up and the subscribe buttons. And why not head over to my channel now, where you can see so much more cruise content. If you'd like to stay on the topic of general cruise tips and advice, then why not come and join me over in this video. Here, I share with you my top 15 things that I think every cruiser must do in their cabin on day one as soon as they get onto the ship. I'll hopefully see you over there, and thank you so much for watching this video today.